So much. And I just wanted to make reference to the previous segment, which was with Valentin Lopez, who is the chairperson for the Amamutsun tribe that are the first peoples here of the Monterey Bay region. He had a very beautiful message, an informative message, and sharing with us how his people live with fire in a much different way than we do so today. So I think it's a really wonderful segue to introduce you all to Jessica Morse, who is the Deputy Secretary for Forest Resources Management for the California Natural Resources Agency. In her role, she is working to increase the pace and scale of forest restoration throughout California. She'll be highlighting the economic benefits also that are possible while also improving the climate resiliency and job development opportunities. So quite a task that we've assigned to you, Jessica. So glad you're here, and I will turn the floor over to you now.
Thank you so much. An honor to be here with all of you after a really tough fire season. And I know how much everyone was personally impacted and how devastating it is to have a community really hit so hard. And so I've got a couple slides up here that I'm hoping y'all can see. And I want to talk through a little bit about this year's fire season, how we got here and as a state and what we can do about it. So this year was a particularly intense fire season. We've had nearly 5 million acres burn this year alone. And just to give you a point of reference, last fire season we had 277,000 acres burn by comparison. So this is dramatically larger than any fire season in California's record. We had 5 of the top 10 largest wildfires burning simultaneously this summer. So that gives you a concept of just how incredibly impactful this was. And not only was this an impact to communities and homes lost, but it was also an impact to our biodiversity and the health of our state. These are really cascading climate impacts, and they will continue to have cascading effects. So for example, of these fires, we had a lot of high severity burn areas, which will result in damaged watersheds. Our watersheds won't retain as much water. We'll have a lot of topsoil runoff and debris flow runoff, which could then cause flooding down the line, but it also can cause drought because our forests are not functioning as the water retainers that they're supposed to be and the reservoirs that they're supposed to be serving as for our state. We're also going to be losing and impacting our carbon sequestration capacity as high severity burn areas, conifer forests, convert to shrublands, and we lose that carbon storage capacity of trees, and shrublands convert to grasslands. So we're seeing native species turn over and vegetation type change as a consequence of these fires. We're also seeing a pretty dramatic impact from our fires on our biodiversity, where we are seeing native species like the California condor, for example. Out of 200 condors, 13 were missing at the end of the Dolan fire. And that's an incredibly endangered species. And so we are seeing these impacts on species, communities, ecosystems, ecology, and it'll take centuries to recover in some cases. Now, we are a fire-adapted ecology, as you've heard in the video before, that Native tribes in California managed proactively our landscape for fire-adapted ecology for millennia, that typically we would have about 4 million acres burn a year throughout the state. Because these are fire-adapted ecologies, the fires would come through and an ecologically managed forest would be a low severity burn. So think low temperature, something around like 200 degrees maybe, versus
Hey,
I'm
just going to jump in and let you know that we're only seeing, you're not in presentation mode. So I don't know if you can change that, or you can maybe just push the slides ahead in the view we're seeing. Yeah.
You know what? We practiced ahead of time, so I'll just turn the screen share off because that was the challenge that we thought we fixed, and clearly we didn't.
Okay,
so,
no worries.
Yeah, no worries. We'll just go without pictures. So basically, we're looking at a fire-adapted ecology, and the challenge is that our ecology is out of sync. So when tribal management of fire was suppressed by colonialism and later the gold rush, we lost the adaptive management and that our ecology is ready for. That you have low intensity fires come through, they result in allowing species to germinate at certain temperatures. Native species, it leaves a little bit of char on the topsoil, which then allows it actually to retain more water, and it thins out the old and dead and weaker trees, and allows trees to thrive and be bigger and have less competition. So really, we are adapted for fire, but with that gone, what happened is that we had a century of buildup of overly dense forests. And so now we have this intense fuel load on the landscape. And so instead of having an ecological low burning fire come through, we have these catastrophic fires that come. They are incredibly hot. They burn up into the tree canopy, and they leave us with and they leave nothing in its wake. You know, they leave dead trees, they burn intensely into the topsoil. You have that soil runoff, then the soil can't retain water, and you have the vegetation type conversion. So once that native land management was suppressed, our ecology is out of balance, and it requires intervention to get back onto pace. You know, we had also, we're dealing with consequences from the gold rush era. We had gold rush clear cutting of our old growth forests, which then grew back overly dense. You had a lot of small, same age trees come through, and that made them more vulnerable to fire. But it also meant that then we had on top of that a policy from the Forest Service, which was nascent at the time, that became a fire suppression policy. The Forest Service motto was fires out by 10 a.m. And it's a really important point here, because this was actually a political decision from 1910 that we are still dealing with the consequences of today. And the politics of the day are really fascinating here, because Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, who were leading the conservation movement, this very radical concept of public land and preserved land, it was embraced by Congress in the day. And so when the Forest Service was established to be able to protect this public land and the conservation movement, Congress didn't want to fund them. And so Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, even though they understood the ecological role that fire played on the landscape, they presented the Forest Service to Congress as a fire suppression agency and as a tool to be able to save the West from catastrophic fires. And in the wake of the big burn in 1910, Congress decided to actually fund the Forest Service as a fire suppression agency. And that led to essentially a full century of fire suppression and removing proactively fire from the landscape. And so it's left us with areas that should have been burning every 5 to 10 years, burning every 90 to 100 years. And that is a catastrophic fire that the ecology is not adapted for. Now, the other factor compounding this year that we saw in climate change, we are seeing cascading climate events clashing with overly dense forests suffering from that fire suppression legacy. And it is leading to these catastrophic fires we have today. The lightning complex fires that we suffered this summer are a direct example of that. So we had a heat wave that launched 130-degree heat, one of the highest temperatures on the planet, down in Death Valley this summer, and it triggered these dry lightning strikes. Over 11,000 lightning strikes triggered 900 fires at the same time, and including all of the ones we saw in the Monterey Bay and Santa Cruz area. And so those fires were burning at once, and they were hitting overly dense forests, causing this devastation. Another really good example is the Creek Fire, which started in September down in the Southern Sierra. We had a 1 in 1,000-year drought experience in California from 2012 to 2015 that triggered tree mortality. The overly dense forests were stressed, and you add drought on top of it, it made those trees really weak, and you add heat on top of it, and that a native beetle that should have been killed off every winter by cold freezing temperatures and pushed out of the trees by highly moistened trees with lots of sap, that beetle was allowed to thrive because its population went unchecked by the warm winters, and the trees no longer had the tools to be able to fight off that beetle. And so we had 167 million trees die off from the consequences of that drought. And those trees have been standing up until now. And it's interesting to know beetle targets large diameter trees. It'll target the older growth, bigger trees, as opposed to the small, weak trees, which is usually what's weeded out by natural fire. And so the big trees now are left dead throughout the forest. And these stands where you're having sections like in the Southern Sierra where you have 80 to 90% of the trees dying off, they had been standing. But this year is the first year we saw them falling down. And it's a very different fire behavior to have ground fuel be 30-inch diameter trees versus what our fire prediction models are, which is usually 3-inch diameter wood. So you suddenly have a fuel load that is unprecedented and unpredictable because of the consequences of this 1 in 1,000-year climate change driven drought that we had. And that led to a really phenomenal consequence of the creek fire, which was called standing combustion. Usually a fire burns through and it burns off that small fuel, and it leads to trees that are, it leads to a fire that is high intensity, but on the fronts of the fire, and the center of that fire footprint is smoldering. In the creek fire, where instead of having 3-inch diameter wood driving the fuel, you have these massive, essentially bonfire capacity wood driving the fire, you actually have standing combustion, so active flames throughout thousands of acres at the same time, throughout the entire footprint of the fire. And this led to an incredibly unpredictable environment. So it created a pillar that went 50,000 feet into the air of smoke. And that, it's called a pyrocumulonimbus cloud. And that created its own weather system that created lightning strikes, it created fire tornadoes, and it would collapse every couple days on firefighters on the ground, sending out hurricane force winds every direction in the fire. So there wasn't just one front to this fire, it was unpredictable and would move out rapidly when that pillar collapsed. Because of condensation in the upper atmosphere. That led to people being trapped and stranded. We saw those dramatic rescues of the National Guard crews coming in and pulling people out of that creek fire, and in incredible rescues around Shaver Lake and Huntington Lake to really get people out because it was such an unpredictable environment. So I want to really give understanding that it's a really clear example of where climate change is meeting forest policy, creating exponentially worse crises than we have dealt with before. And the creek fire, just as a point of comparison, that standing combustion model, when I talked to a fire scientist at Berkeley, he told me that they hadn't seen and they don't study real life examples of standing combustion except for the Tokyo firebombing in World War II. So we were experiencing war zone-like conditions in California driven by climate change. So this is really an intense situation, but there is hope for us. And so I'm sorry I don't have a picture with you, but for you of this, but there's a forest, a conifer forest down in Baja California that never had fire suppression. It was naturally managed by lightning and it never had its old growth removed. So it is a resilient forest. And so you end up with this beautiful, thin, well, healthy conifer forest in Baja California. So that tells us that this ecology can adapt to rising temperature and the climate change we are facing if we manage it well. We have to get back to that tribal knowledge and the caliber of management that Native Americans had been doing on our landscapes, on our conifer forests, our oak woodlands, our grasslands for millennia. And that means we need active intervention. And to be able to create these fire resilient ecologies and communities as a state, we need active management on 3 fronts. Fire resilience in California is, I think of it, imagine concentric circles. So we have the innermost circle would be that community, have our communities hardened and established with enough defensible space around your home so that in the worst case scenario, a fire comes through, that your community is able to survive and withstand that fire. The next layer would be strategic fuel breaks. These are thin strips of land and forest where a firefighter can approach a fire. It lays the fire down and enables us to be able to take a stand and stop that fire from coming into a community. That was one of the governor's first actions when he came into office. He declared an emergency before the emergency, and CAL FIRE and the National Guard and the California Conservation Corps worked triple time to establish strategic fuel breaks, including in your region, throughout the state, so that we could take a stand. And those came into play in a really significant way this fire season. This fire season was catastrophic, but those fuel breaks came into play, and where they were, they did save towns and lives and communities and created escape routes. And so we have those hardened communities, strategic fuel breaks to be able to arrest the fire before it comes in. And then the last piece is really this entire landscape approach of making sure that our landscape is fire resilient so that we actually have thinned, healthy forests, that we have grasslands that have the right fire return interval on them, oak woodlands that have fire coming through them at low temperatures so that they are getting rid of invasive species and really thriving. And so fire can have a cleansing impact, but we need to be able to first reduce the fuel load by thinning out the forests and removing invasive species, and make sure that then we are managing it with prescribed fire and increase our prescribed fire efforts going forward. And that's a big focus of the state as well, where we're trying to improve both our capacity to improve our regulatory environment so that we are creating expedited paths that used to take about 2 years to get this fuel reduction and forest restoration work done, just to get it through CEQA approval process. And a lot of that was a review timeline as opposed to the actual due diligence of the environmental work on the ground. And so what we've done for fire projects, that we have established something called the Cal VTP, the Vegetation Treatment Program, and it is a 20 million acre pre-environmental review that we did through a couple year long public process, and have for any project that's going to be done on those 20 million acres of land, you have an expedited process as long as you're following these due diligence for your fire resilience program. So forest health, fuel reduction type activities. It's very narrow in its scope of what you can do. You couldn't build a building, for example, but you can do that fuel reduction work, and we have an expedited pace while still ensuring the due diligence is done. Another big step we've taken is really dramatic investment in fuel reduction work and prescribed fire. We have been giving grants to tribes through our Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program to be able to increase prescribed fire on the landscape and actually incorporate that tribal knowledge into our practices, and ensure that when we're working with tribes, that we are doing it in a way that we are asking tribes, what are your equities on the ground? Not just protecting sort of historic sites, but also saying, what are the native species that are useful for cultural ceremonies or basket weaving or whatever tools or medicines that tribe needs them for, that we are adapting our fire prescription to make sure that we are enhancing those particular species. Another great example with partnering with ecologists too, the California Native Plant Society and CAL FIRE partner up on these strategic fuel breaks. There's a great example of one in Colfax where they teamed up to do the fuel break, and it improves the fire safety around Colfax. It's this thin strip, but they have been managing it now with prescribed fire, which has allowed native morning glories to germinate, milkweed to germinate. And so you actually have monarch butterflies returning to an area that had been dense manzanita and is back to its native oak woodland. And it's a strategic fuel break where firefighters can take a stand, but it's also enhancing our biodiversity and our ecology. So on all three of these fronts, from home and community hardening to strategic fuel breaks to really enhancing full watershed scale events, we are really working on every front with a lot of depth to make sure that we are creating a fire adapted and fire resilient ecology and community for California. Because climate change is here, but what we can do is ensure that our ecologies and our communities are resilient for it, and that these fire seasons are no longer devastating for us as a state.
Thank you so much. Getting a little echo there, but I just wanted to say that your presentation that I had the pleasure of seeing a few months ago when you presented to the California Stewardship Network, I just knew when I saw it that I needed to have you here at our event because it resonates so well. And I learned so much when I saw your slides. And just, I'm sorry for the technical difficulty with your slides. Just so folks know, we will have those posted on the website along with this video. So they'll be able to see those slides. And I think it's just so interesting to learn about how we got to this position. And your talk does such a good job of outlining that. I think maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how the state is partnering with Native tribes throughout the state, and gives maybe some specific examples, and what specifically, if you know of anything that's happening here in the Monterey Bay region along those lines.
Sure. I don't know that I have a good Monterey example off the top of my head. I'm so sorry. But there's a couple examples. So with tribes that are major landholders, like the Karuk tribe up in Northern California, they're part of one of our major collaboratives, the North Coast Regional Partnership, and they're on the board of that and are major grant recipients. So I think last year we gave out I believe about $10 million to tribes for fuel reduction and forest health activities. But we're also partnering with tribes in job creation areas. So the Hungalechi tribe up in Alpine County, I think they're a part of a Washoe tribe, and they are partnering with a program. The acronym is CHIPS. I have to confess, I don't remember what it actually stands for, but it's a workforce development program with several of the counties, and also partnership with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy through the state. And so we've been funding that so that these members of this tribe are getting trained in prescribed fire, fuel reduction, how to be hand crews, and they are actively now the crews on a lot of these forest management and fuel reduction projects in their community. And so are having a really good, so it's a tribe that doesn't have a lot of land holding, but they live in a heavily forested community, and so are able to create good, steady paying jobs for their tribal members throughout that region doing climate work.
Yeah. You know, at MBEP, we always try to look at taking two negatives and making it a win-win and flipping it around. And we have unemployment and we have this fire resilience issue. So Johnny actually asked a question along these same lines to build on what you're talking about, workforce. I just wanted to mention to folks that in the Sierras, they have a curriculum at their community college. And the Kate of that group, Steve Frisch, and I are in conversations about how to bring that curriculum to our region to train folks, because it's not like you just take a class and you're off. It's pretty, technical a lot of times to really understand how to do proper fire management and forest resiliency tactics. So I just want to emphasize that. But I just love this idea of figuring out how we move people that are either underemployed or unemployed right now, given the recession, and move them into jobs that could actually help our region be more fire resilient. So yay on that.
It's really,
yeah. Go ahead.
It's really crucial. No, the workforce development aspect and starting small rural businesses out of this it's such a key foundation of our success here, because we as a state have committed to treat 500,000 acres a year. The federal government just signed an agreement with us to treat 500,000 acres a year. That would get us to 1 million acres a year treated, so thinned out, and get us on a really dramatic pace to start tackling this. But we cannot do it without the workforce in place. We're finding shortages in that area, and the businesses popping up. And so one of the things the governor had proposed last year that exists right now but is not funded currently is the Climate Catalyst Fund. And so it is a program that would create low interest loans for people to start up businesses with either small masticators or especially to be innovative with the feedstock coming out of the forest.
Yeah,
Because
we
there's
get a chance to talk about that, which I wish we had more time, but we're going to get cut off in 14 seconds. I've learned this. Biomass processing and the jobs there is huge. I think we'll save that for another conversation. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's wonderful to have you and your leadership and all